May I say good evening and welcome to all of you to one more of Mercantile Barristers webinars. Thank you very much for joining us. It'd be a pleasure to share a few thoughts with you this evening. If it is at all possible, could I please ask you to mute yourselves on entry? If you should have any questions whilst I'm doing the presentation, you'd be most welcome to put your questions in the chat at the outset. But clearly we will have a proper, as is often the case, we will have a lively Q&A session at the end. And of course, everyone will be unmuted and we can then have a proper discussion. If we are all muted at the outset, it ensures that we can actually flow in one direction during the presentation, and we will all mutually benefit from it. As I say once more, you're welcome. Whilst we spend this hour together, and I hope it will be constructive and valuable. Our subject this evening is how to avoid the risks inherent in the procurement of construction contracts. It goes without saying that all of you participants and attendees at this evening's webinar would, in one way or other, be involved in construction contracts and the procurement of the same. The experience teaches us that issues arise in that process, and the object of this evening's webinar is to address some of those, not all of it. Now, for those of you who have not attended any of our prior webinars and don't know me, I'm Samuel Okoronkwo. I started my professional career as a QS. I then read project management and property development as a master's level and became involved in the procurement and delivery of a substantial number of landmark projects. And then, of course, I find myself finishing off as a barrister. So I share your experiences from firsthand, and I can therefore speak to you about them, but I think with a degree of authority. Clearly, you can raise questions with me in that regard afterwards. So presently, as a barrister, I'm primarily engaged in drafting contracts that achieve clients' objectives. Now, there are various objectives, differing objectives that occur in the course of construction contracts, and it is very, very necessary that individual contracts are drafted to suit the objectives that the clients or the employers intend to achieve. I advise on how to actively and proactively manage our disputes in construction contracts. Of course, I become significantly involved in resolution of construction contract disputes and resolving the disputes that arise in that process. I adjudicate and arbitrate construction disputes, and of course I litigate them in the law courts, those that are not resolved through the various other alternative methods of resolution. Because we're dealing with the risks and the disputes that they cause, one of the key causes of disputes in construction contracts is ambiguity. Now, clarity helps a great deal, and the absence of clarity is very rapidly filled with ambiguity. Now, if you can therefore eliminate ambiguity at source, you will find that you will eliminate a substantial amount of disputes. So just bear that in mind, just pause whilst you're in the construction process. If what you're doing, saying, specifying, drawing, is clear, then it is unambiguous. Therefore, you would have avoided disputes. But if there is any degree of ambiguity, you bet your bottom dollar it will be turning up, materializing itself in one dispute or another. Now, solving a dispute, solving a construction dispute through adjudication, arbitration, or litigation is an expensive exercise. It is far more cost-effective to avoid it if you can. Now, this is something that I bang on about repeatedly because one sees how clients feel when they find themselves exposed to an adjudication process or an arbitration process, or for that matter, a lot worse in litigation, because the costs that you then incur have very limited relationship, if you like, to the dispute that began, because the costs can run away. And on each occasion, you will find yourself spending more. So if you can avoid it, why don't you? You should. And avoiding it ought to be your watchword. So in this webinar, we'll be trying to look at 4 primary areas of risk in construction contracts. The first one is what I describe as the contract objectives. Now, more often than not, participants in the course of construction contracts enter the contract without being clear in their mind what the contract objectives are. Now, the contract objectives are the primary objective that the promoter or the employer or the client wishes to achieve. Are you building accommodation or hostels for an educational institution that has to be completed before the students return? If that is the case, you may well find that the primary objective of that contract is time. Are you looking to deliver a project specifically for a particular budget, irrespective of whether or not it overruns by a week or 2 or a month or 2? You may well find that the objective is cost. Or are there other hidden objectives? It is incumbent upon the employer who is orchestrating the project to identify those objectives and therefore communicate them to members of the design team and members of the construction team. So identify the contract objectives and make sure that they are unambiguous. Contractual obligations, second area of risk. Clearly, construction is a team effort and there are various members of the team. So you are a member of the design and or construction team. What is your obligation? Are you the architect? If you are, your primary obligation may well be the timely production of buildable information, construction drawings, not design drawings. You've used your design to secure planning consent, but are you producing working drawings, which is what the contractors require on-site in order to deliver the construction work? Are you the quantity surveyor? Are you managing the budget? Are you the project manager? Are you controlling all members of the team? What are your contractual obligations? Now, once you've identified those contractual obligations, ask yourself how it relates to the contract objectives. And of course, we're perennially afflicted with variations on construction contracts. That is a third risk item. And of course, program, time. Time is never, ever sufficient to deliver the contract that you have signed up to deliver within 30 weeks or within 40 weeks. So contract objectives, contractual obligations, variations, and program overruns, key areas of risk inherent in virtually all construction contracts that you will encounter. How to ensure that the contract objectives are fulfilled. Now, if you have identified those contract objectives, both the written and the unwritten, the objectives will be fulfilled if they are communicated, if they are well understood, if you have the buy-in of everyone involved in the process in trying to achieve that. So, as I said, there are written objectives of the contract. So the contract comes, it is to build a shiny 12-story office block, or it is to do a new retail fit out. Now, there is, of course, has been tendered and a budget has been agreed. But what are the objectives? Is it a retail store that you're building? If it is a retail store that you're building and there is a run up to Christmas, in my experience, the operators would like to hand that store completed from the construction team to the store management team latest by the end of September. Now, if the contract objectives is to deliver this store ready for the Christmas trade, that has to be communicated to the design team, to the construction team, that that is the primary project contract objective. Now, we may well say that this is a 20-week project that will end by the 20th of September, by the 30th of September, say. Now, if for any reason there is an overrun, and by the way, the contract is allowed to overrun, then you may well find that if you're not going to finish until the middle of November, you have not met the contract objective. So the primary project contract objective will have to be understood, be it budget, be it timescale, be it the quality. Then it will have to be communicated clearly to all stakeholders: contractors, subcontractors, architects, quantity surveyors, engineers of all types. Now, once it is communicated, ensure that their buy-in to it is secured as well. Now, the way you do this communication is through your contract correspondence. You need to emphasize the primary objective of your contract at the earliest possible opportunity. And once you have stated it, you repeat it. So, for example, once the contract's been let, in the very first site meeting, one of the primary things you want recorded is that our emphasis is to complete this by this date. Now, in subsequent communication, you harp on about it so that everyone is aware of that objective, so that they can all be pulling and pushing in one direction. Now, you must avoid what I describe as vague definitions of quality. If, and on one or two occasions I've encountered specification where it is stated that it is to be built to the highest quality standards. Now, with respect, quality is relative and is subjective. If a contract requires a particular component, or indeed the whole project to be built to specified standards, then those standards must be specified. If they are unspecified, they are left ambiguous. What you as the employer may deem as a high or a low standard may well be what your contractor considers to be a high standard. And if there is that ambiguity, there therefore is the foundation laid therein for difficulties. So how to identify the difference between the contract objectives and the contractual obligations? Now, if you have an objective that is specified, and then you have your obligation, which does not relate to that objective, then you have a dichotomy that is literally pre-programmed for dispute. So, for example, if you are looking to deliver a project for a particular time, and the contractor has within the contract documents provisions for extension of time on the occurrence of relevant events, when those relevant events occur and the contractor applies for an extension of time, he will be entitled to receive that extension of time, and the extension of time may then exceed the contract objective of being able to deliver that particular project for a particular date. Now, you have then to ask yourself how you marry the contract objectives with the contractual obligations. The way you do that is to avoid silo thinking. So when everyone is in his bunker, when the architect believes that his challenge is only to produce the design and the working drawings and nothing else, and the contractor is sitting there saying, well, I can't build anything until I get the information that I require. Now, people are then in their own bunkers, in their own silos. There isn't joined up thinking. So the way you get success is to try and achieve joined up thinking. And joined up thinking requires that once the contract is let, the contractor should actually consider his information requirement to suit the construction program that he has achieved. And he may well be well advised to give the architect early warning as to when specific working drawings will be required for particular work components or work elements. And by the same token, when the contractor has produced the contract program, members of the design team must not receive construction programs and file them, because that's what the contractor has produced. Let's face it, all of us attending this webinar this evening have a degree of experience of varying number of years of duration in the construction industry. We know what works and what doesn't work. So when you receive a contract program from a contractor, interrogate it, challenge it, test it. So if a contractor tells you he will put up 200 square meters of cladding in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, that is what the construction program has allowed for. Ask the question, how are you going to do this? You know, they developed a robot overnight that is likely to produce at this speed. And if we're going to erect at this speed, how are we going to handle quality assurance, ensuring that we don't rapidly put them all up only for all the joints to start leaking at the sign of the first winter? So ensure that you get out of your own box, challenge what the other member of the construction and or design team is doing. And the challenge, it isn't destructive challenge, it is constructive challenge to it. And when you constructively challenge what your stakeholders and other partners are doing, they will retort. And if you point out a deficiency in a constructive manner, people are more likely to receive it and therefore be able to make the necessary corrections. Now, for the architects and the specifiers who are specifying materials and components, ask yourself, are you specifying what can be procured within the contract program? So again, I say, so when you start at the outset, when you're challenging the construction program, one initial question to ask a good contractor is, what are the long delivery items that you have identified during your tender process? If you have identified any long delivery items, ask, have you placed orders for them? Or when is the latest possible date that you can place orders for either the manufacture or the delivery in order for us to achieve your construction program? Now, these are very intelligent questions that will challenge, you are challenging each other to respond. Now, I worked on a case where marble's been specified for the flooring and the walls, Carrara marbles. I think the contractor found out later on in the evening that it was on a 16-week delivery period. And he was on a 16-week delivery period, and the contract has 16 weeks to go. An impossibility, one will say. But then when you reverse engineer the process, you can see that no one thought at the earliest possible opportunity to challenge the necessity to use that specific product, or indeed that if that was a prerequisite of the project, that an early order has been placed for it. So for specification for materials and components, very, very important to challenge them at the earliest possible opportunity. Now, how to manage variations during the life cycle of the project. Now, the variations are a given. There are very few projects, unless they are prefabricated, that don't change between the commencement and the completion. Now, the best way to manage variations is to prepare adequately at the outset. So we tend to say at the bar that the cases that are actually won in court are won in court in advocacy on the basis of the preparation that one has done in chambers. By the same token, in the construction industry, if you have specified well, programmed well, resourced adequately, you will find that the likelihood of variations will be minimized. Now, not only will the likelihood of variations be minimized, once variations then arise, then it's incumbent upon you to be able to identify the change. I can recall several occasions as a claims surveyor, when you're invited to say, look, we have completed this project, this is how much we spent, is far in excess of the contract sum. Can you look between the tender documents and the final as-built as to where the variations are, identify them, and that will be the basis of our claim. Now, I say that with almost respect, that is retrospective rearview mirror thinking, because you have not prepared well enough. You were unconscious when the variations were arising. You should always be on the ball whilst things are changing on the project so that you can record them. You can then notify of their consequences of their effect. And more to the point, you should then seek to get the acceptance of those who are in the decision-making position that this thing has actually happened and it is likely to have these consequences. Fantastic if you can agree the cost of variations whilst you're progressing. But if you can't even agree those costs, be certain to notify them and draw it to everyone's attention. That is your first step in being able to achieve a successful resolution afterwards. Now, with those variations, with that as a general concept of how to manage variations, not going into the detail, you should be aware that every variation has a knock-on effect. Now, delays and changes that happen at any particular time or on any particular activity in the course of construction project is bound to have a knock-on effect. So, for example, if your brickwork overruns by 4 weeks, it is likely to impact the time that the flooring or indeed the roofing or other components are attached to it. Now, once that has happened, you should be able to reprogram or at least communicate and share, identify, the knock-on effect at any stage, bear that in mind and take that towards a resolution at that time. The next thing to consider for those who are prone to doing long gestation projects on a significant program runtime, inflation. Clearly, the industry and across the economy, inflation is a key watchword, and the Bank of England is seriously considering increasing interest rates in one way, shape, or form in order to try and deal with inflation. Now, if you are on a long duration project, ask yourself, do you have a fluctuation clause in the contract? If you don't, you perhaps ought to. And even if you don't, you should then be speaking to your employers or the employers speaking to the contractors themselves, just to be careful that you're not running into where costs are exceeding the tender figures that you have put in and you find yourself unable to recover. Now, when variations occur, often it leads to head-to-head between contractor and employer, or indeed the architect, in trying to resolve it. And when those disputes are often perceived as insoluble by one party or another, it can, in certain circumstances, lead to contract abandonment. Now, it is a word of wisdom to endeavor as much as possible to avoid your contract being abandoned. Adopt a pragmatic approach to difficult issues, and you may well be better off trying to reach an accommodation to solve the problem rather than allowing the contract to be abandoned. I'll give you two examples in this case. Now, I'll give you two potential takeaways from it. If you allow your contract to be abandoned, you necessarily will have to find a new contractor to come and start where the old contractor finished. Now, every contractor attending this webinar will know that the step number one, when you are being called on to take on contract that someone else has commenced and abandoned for one reason, is to immediately disclaim any responsibility or liability for anything that has been done before your arrival. You cannot realistically be taking liability on for what someone else has done. So that liability and that responsibility devolves and revolves back to the employer. Now, it goes without saying that the replacement contractor will always charge more than the primary contractor. And they will rapidly tell you that one of the reasons why the contractor on the project abandoned it was because they couldn't make it work. So you're going to suffer additional time in having to bring a replacement contractor on, pay them more, and therefore allow them also to avoid responsibility for what the work they didn't do. Now, I'm presently advising on a case relating to a project at St. Pancras. It was supposed to be a chain of upmarket ladies' salons. And the contractor in that case has received six-figure sums already in the course of the construction contract. It involved early design, early procurement of components that were required. But when the contractor came to the conclusion that they couldn't make it work, suffice it to say that they abandoned the contract. Now, what was even more interesting in that contract was that having abandoned the contract, they promptly liquidated their company. They proceeded to set up another company, and having set up the company, they then had the audacity to revert to the employer to say that, by the way, we now have started a new company. If you'll be minded to retain us to complete that project, we will give you the benefit of your early drawings, which we have, and some other materials that we have in our possession. Now, clearly, there are substantial issues, substantial infringements of various parts of the insolvency law in that matter. But then the contractors did that, and the employer is left in a position where they're having to decide, should we go back to the people that have let us down once before, or should we, in fact, be looking for new contractors? But in any which way, there is a substantial exposure in that regard. So you just have to think about it. When the variations occur and when the difficulties arise, are you actually better off hand-holding your contractor, working collaboratively in order to see the end of the project, rather than allow its abandonment? This by no means is not me supporting a charter of delinquent contractors failing to meet their obligation. Far from it, as the contractor in the case that I'm presently dealing with is obviously experiencing, because the directors themselves are now facing personal action on that matter. So how do you manage program overruns? As I said at the outset, not fully appreciated, often a robust construction program is one of the most significant documents that you would have in the entire construction process. Now, construction involves thousands of materials, hundreds of men and women working in it, coordinating them in a systemized, pretty much military fashion is what a good construction program should do. So a construction program is never a static document that is filed away. And I've dealt with many cases where parties proceeded without being driven by the construction program. Your construction program is a living, dynamic document that should be monitored, reviewed, and reported upon on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. If you keep an eye on your construction program, you will immediately identify which activities that have overrun or are overrunning or are at risk of overrun, so that you can take preemptive action to bring the project back onto line. So ideally, in your construction program, you must always be able to identify the critical path. The critical path is the line which runs from start to finish, on which on every construction activity, your float, i.e. the spare time, is zero. If you have a construction program that you can identify the critical path with zero float, then you are in charge of you're the driver of that project. And that is what you're going to watch with your hawk eye and ensure that it's never, if you like, the critical path is never disturbed. And if the critical path is disturbed, you then can adapt and come back to it. So challenge your construction programs. Does it make sense? Many of them don't make sense because they've been thrown together in a hurry. They require time. The most senior people in construction should keep an eye, not on the global program, but on the detailed program, because when you don't drill down to the granular details, that is when your global picture fails to materialize, and hence the difficulties. Now, with respect to your programs, I take two significant points, particularly given the time of year we're in. Now, you know that if you are doing a construction project that has exterior and interior trades, if you hit the ember months, if you hit the winter months with the project still being exposed to the weather, inclement weather is a relevant item that enables construction programs to be extended typically, because it is unsafe, it is risky, people can't undertake dangerous construction activities in the rain, for example, or in the snow, or when there is excessive frost or wind. So consider how you can adapt your construction program to hit the earliest possible water tightness date, so that you know that once you've got the building watertight, if you've got a roof on it, even if it were a temporary roof, you have safeguarded the interior activities that can proceed and continue during the winter months. If you are left exposed during the winter months, quite clearly, none of the interior activities can safely proceed, particularly where you have things like dry lining, which of course will be wasted in the weather. So there you are with program overruns. Now, I say this repeatedly, a stitch in time saves 9. If you have not prepared to succeed, you have inadvertently prepared to fail. It is always better and cheaper to prevent disputes. So anticipate disputes. In any construction project, assume that it is going to go wrong. And with that mindset, make your preparations, ensuring therefore that you can avoid disputes. Now, I can't state it hard enough, the cost of one dispute is significant. If you can avoid it, the better. Variations. If you encounter variations and you were not prepared for it and you've not recorded it, you have not communicated it, you are most unlikely to get the result you expect. Not surprisingly, because if the employer had only been budgeting a specified amount for a particular work item or element, and you come and you demand triple that, quite clearly, they don't have it to give you, and therefore they'll be reluctant to give it to you. Program delays, we've already mentioned it. Now, you may well find that you have incurred increased labor costs, which you have no prospect of recovering. I pause and then refer to dispute resolution. The time taken and the costs incurred in resolving a dispute through any formal channel can sometimes outweigh the benefits of the resolution itself. I have been involved in several cases where parties have begun formal dispute resolution only to find that they're overwhelmed by the costs and the time implications. I was recently involved in a case that has recently concluded where issues arose such that one party sued for £450,000 when he was then in receipt of a counterclaim of £1.7 million. My opposite number quickly contacted to wonder if there was an opportunity that this matter could be mediated so that costs could be saved. Suffice it to say that his expectation of 450,000 evaporated, and dispute resolution through the formal channels when alternative methods could be deployed early can only be a prudent step to take. Now, review. As a general rule, one should always make time for reflective review of the projects that you're involved in. Now, we have produced at Mercantile Barristers a legal checklist for employers, architects, QSs, contractors on their projects, how to review it and ensure that you can avoid preventable disputes. Now, if you should at any time require assistance with that regard, I'm sure myself and my colleagues will be delighted to be of assistance to you, but you should attempt it yourself. There are key items that you must always keep your eye on. Time does not permit me to run through all of it in greater detail, but I just put it out there for you. Now, in summary terms, therefore, those are the matters that I wish to share with you on the one side, and on your side, I'm sure you're working on different projects, and it will be up to you to raise some questions that you may have so that we can talk about them, because often these points are better amplified on specifics when you have them. So that's my presentation to you, and I will wait your questions. Probably time to unmute.
Samuel.
Listening, yes, sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to, there's a couple of questions, I think, in the chat as well. So there's a couple of people asking questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, they can do. But Samuel, we had a conversation the other day and we talked about, your presentation's gone off. What percentage of projects actually end up in dispute? You know, from your point of view in the courts.
Oh.
And what's I'm not asking you for your success rate because you're a modest man, but how does it, give us an example of what happens in the courts? I mean, you've said that everybody wants to, you should avoid the court process because, you know, not your version, but nobody wins. So what's some of the key reasons why you don't want to go to court? And two, what percentage of projects end up in that situation or end up in dispute?
It is reputed that about 9 out of 10 construction projects have one dispute or another. In fact, the High Court of Justice has a separate division, the Construction and Technology Court, that does nothing else for construction projects. Construction, perhaps, has the highest usage of legal services than most other industries. So what percentage of construction projects finish up in disputes? Quite a lot to that. Why should you avoid disputes? Is the second part of your question, if I got that correctly?
Yeah. I'm alluding to the fact that a barrister who stands up in front of judges every day is telling people not to go there.
Yes, and that is, and my colleagues at the bar asked me that question as well. I mean, put it bluntly, win, lose or draw, the barristers get paid. So they like you to dispute. They like you to fight cases. But sit back and look at it. You are in business to achieve your business objectives. You're not in business to pay lawyers. And if you can avoid paying lawyers, what could be better? And I say this from first-hand experience of having been in the industry with you. Once a dispute begins, it has a life of its own. So once the proceedings have started, there's no point saying, I want to spend £20,000 in litigation. No, it will double and it will be tripling at the point where you have directions from the court that you must comply with. And failure to comply leads to even more stringent sanctions by the court, which also hits you in the pocket. And more often than not, one sits back and looks at the cost of having resolved a dispute. And you actually, in a review, tell the client, if you had actually come to me by this time, you might have only taken 1 day of my time to have resolved this problem than finding yourself having to engage 20, 30 days of my time in the course of your litigation, which would of course cost you that much more. So the necessity to avoid disputes if you can, it speaks for itself. You know, if you're being sensible about protecting yourself.
And I'm going to ask one more question just while we're waiting for anybody else to ask a question specifically. One key point, and Samuel, you might not want to answer this as well because of your modesty. Why engage a barrister over a solicitor?
I think there's background noise. Why engage a barrister instead of a solicitor? That's a good question. Quite clearly, solicitors and barristers do slightly two different things. It used to be the case that the barristers were concentrated in doing the advocacy at the sharpest end when the matter is in court. I mean, if it suits your circumstances, have both. But if you did ask me whether I should consult a GP or a specialist in order to solve my problems at the earliest possible time, it may be that a specialist can actually give you quicker answer more cost effectively. But that is not to say that there aren't excellent solicitors that can do the same. But the point is that if you're going to end up litigating the matter, if you're going to end up finishing in front of a judge, I think it's wise counsel to get barristers' input at the earliest possible opportunity. Because barristers are, and I say this from that perspective, are dispassionate. They look at your case as a judge will look at your case. They will not jump into your corner and take whatever position you're taking for the sake of it. Now, I'm not saying that all solicitors do that, but on multiple occasions, I have dealt with matters where the solicitor has taken their client's position and been totally blinkered to the potential counterblast that will be coming from the other side. And I've just already given an example where a £450,000 claim met a £1.7 million counterclaim, and they buckled at that point. And that is only but one example. I'm somewhat reticent about over-laboring that point, because solicitors are very useful in what they do, as I'm sure barristers are equally. Putting it as modestly as I can, that is.
If anybody else has any questions, feel free. But one other question I want to just get out there. If somebody's got a case or a dispute, obviously, if it gets to, claims and things like that, it's going to have its own life.
Yes.
But can you, obviously you need to review documents and stuff, but can you give a realistic appraisal of whether this is successful, whether you should try and avoid court? Can you do that? My experience of working with other non-barristers is you can't get that answer.
No, well, barristers will always, a good barrister should always, having appraised your matter, give you an indication of your prospect of succeeding in the claim. So practically every claim that you bring before the court will have essential elements, and one will immediately try to identify whether those essential elements are in existence or not. And if they are not in existence, then you'll be directed to find them if they exist. But if they don't exist, you advise against the matter. Only yesterday, I strongly advised against in fact, the matter had been to the court in the first instance and had been lost, and it'd been brought to me on appeal. And I'd reviewed the matter, and I strongly advised the client against appealing the matter, because I judged that the claim ought not to have begun in the first instance, and that the appeal had just as limited prospect of success as did the primary claim. So clearly, advising on the prospect of success is a key element that that we do, that I think a good barrister should.
Any other questions?
Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, Samuel, it's Andrew Diamantis.
Hello, Andrew. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It's occurred to me, just out of interest, following on from what Dean has been asking you, what percentage of the I'm particularly interested in pre-contract. I mean, disputes tend to occur where when you've got your pre-contract wrong, I think. And my question is, what percentage of the disputes that you see are design and build, and what percentage are traditional, have gone down the traditional procurement route, i.e. a full design by tender stage?
It appears to be a greater degree of ambiguity in DMBs. Yeah, because the nature of it is that the employer would have retained an architect in order to secure consent, and then sought to novate the architect and the design to a contractor. Now, the contractor comes to it with a slightly different perspective, and you find that there are greater opportunities there for misunderstanding, because the contractor has to start re-specifying the whole thing. And that is what I'd say about 60-40 DMB on the higher side.
Right, okay.
So where the pre-contract is, but then don't forget that some of the post-contract disputes are traced back to the pre-contract, if you like, deficiencies, but when one is actually critically analyzing them.
Yeah.
Samuel?
Yes, who's asking?
Elias Hayward. If Andrew's finished his question or not, I've got a question for you.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
In your presentation, it's very good, very useful. You mentioned project or potential project abandonment.
Yes.
Not a term that I've come across in 30 years of construction issues as a quantity surveyor. You put it in the context of a contractor who is on a long contract and the prices of materials, etc., go above his sort of tender pricing levels, which then means he then decides to abandon the project. Under a standard Phase 2 contract, there's obviously termination clauses which allow both parties in the event of default to terminate the contract. How does a contractor abandon a project for the reasons that you sort of gave in your presentation, or is it a bit not as straightforward as that in terms of the specific facts of that particular case?
You see, more often than not, when these cases come before you, what you look for is the reason behind the reason.
Yeah.
When a contractor chooses to liquidate, and they do liquidate from time to time, they've considered that they probably can't continue with this project, given the contract sum that they've tied themselves to.
Yeah.
So, and when you look in greater detail into it, they probably have a couple of bad contracts running within the firm, and they're finding that cash flow is in difficulty. They are not looking to use a contractual clause to abandon the contract. The net effect is that they liquidate in the middle of it. And that would have followed a period of frantic effort to extract more money from the employer, or in your case, from the QS. And the QS say, no, I can't approve that, I can't approve that, I can't approve that. And when they find that they can't, it is not necessarily the long gestation of the contract or the inflationary costs that will be the lone reason, as I'm sure you're aware. When it goes wrong, there are a multiplicity of reasons that add up to the same conclusion. So what they tend to do, you have a high frequency of liquidations in construction, as I'm sure you're aware. In fact, the reason behind that liquidation is them deciding to abandon the contracts that they have just because they can't deal with
Okay,
it.
so it's in that context then, isn't it?
Yeah, it is in that context.
You'd like to think they would come to you first if they had an issue, but even they say, look, give us some more money to bail us out of our cash flow. As an employer, or make a recommendation to employer, you've got no guarantees. So it's highly unlikely that an employer is going to say, okay, I'll put some more money into the pot to keep them going, because he'll just take that money and still liquidate. So it's a bit of a no.
That's a very interesting point. Yes, if you hand them all the money, they'll still take it and liquidate. When a contractor approaches you to ask for more money, you try and tie it down to key milestones.
Yeah.
So, for example, the example that I haven't, of course, named the case that I'm presently advising on because it is live, you have components that have been procured by the contractor in the name of the contractor, but for the benefit of this project. Now, with the liquidation and the insolvency, all of those components and the ones that are being fabricated in factories hither and yonder are in the ownership of the liquidator.
Yeah.
Now, if you are a QS having to advise your employer, you may well begin to break it down and say, okay, which components are causing you the most difficulty? Let us go to that supplier of that component and procure that element such that it is tied in ownership back to us and to our project, so that in the unlikely event of your insolvency, we can take delivery.
Yeah,
not delivery.
You protect your program as well, don't you, by making sure you've got rights or ownership to that material.
Correct. So that is one, and also with resources for men that the laborers that they will have on site for particular skills. You may then say, okay, in return for you putting X number of fitters on site for that date, we will cover this.
Yeah.
But then they have to be delivering it in order to be receiving the money. So you're feeding them, because ordinarily you're on your 4 weekly interim valuation cycles.
Yeah.
And then the architect takes a further 14 days to issue the certificate, and the employer may take another 7 days. Now, if you're looking at it, this contractor is out of pocket for 8 weeks before the money arrives in his account. He has exceeded his overdraft already, and he can't hold his men and procure materials for 8 weeks without being paid. So what you're doing is that you're funding the cash flow, but not for any other project, specifically for your project, tying it so neatly that your client get the benefit. You will find that you will leave that contractor on your site finishing your project, allowing them, cutting them some slack, but then saving yourself the headache of having to re-procure the project that has already been abandoned, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, you're avoiding the project abandonment by trying to work with the contractor with, it's not a dispute per se, but you're working with him rather than terminating his contract and then causing all the headache of having to replace the contractor. So.
Exactly, and I find that when I advise in those circumstances, additional clauses and protections that are written in are very easily agreed to, because the contractor sees that there is a genuine intent to assist him to deliver the project, whilst also ensuring that the client's money is not being unnecessarily risked. Yeah.
I just hope his other risks on his other projects don't take him down at the end of the day, but you can't legislate for that side of it.
Right, then it's gone beyond your scope. You just want to ensure that even if he's going down, that your is sheltered.
Okay. No, thanks for that, Samuel. Thank you.
Pleasure. Good. More questions, if there are any?
Hi, Samuel. Good to see you again. Thank you for your presentation. Always informative.
Good.
Yes, I just wanted to touch on variations very briefly. Obviously, variations change, and most of the time there's an element of cost to that. But one of the factors that tends to come in, being on various sides of the fence, whether it be the architect, contractor, or client, is the distinction between a change and what's considered design development.
Classic. It's a very
and-
a person that can only come from an architect. Carry on.
Well, I've been on the other side of the contractor as well and argued with the architect. But I guess my question is, in some instances, it's very, very clear what's a variation, what's a change, and so on and so forth. And other areas, there seems to be, it seems to be grey. That's why there's a dispute. Is there a case or judgment handed down to clearly state the difference between the two?
There are several. I endeavor as much as possible, particularly this late in the evening, not to bombard my audience with black letter law. But let me talk to you conceptually. As a general rule, the way you deal with variations is omissions and additions. Okay, so a genuine variation. So let us say, for example, that you have specified ceramic tiles, but for some inexplicable reason, you have now decided to go with porcelain tiles. So you deduct the amount that was allowed in for ceramic tiles and add back in the amount that's been put in for porcelain tiles. However, if there is a performance specification which says that the contractor in his design and build proposition is to allow for tiling to this area, so let's say to the kitchen areas. Now, one expects that in that pricing document, there would have been a PC or a provisional sum that is set aside on a cost per square meter for the supply only. Now, within that, you have the bandwidth for design development. So if they come up with porcelain tiles that cost £50 per square meter, and your PC or provisional allowance was £30 per square meter, all you have to do is say no. The difficulty arises where that allowance was for £30 per square meter, and a proposition has been put for a particular material that will cost £50 per square meter. No one was aware as to the real cost of it until that has been procured. So the design and build contractor will say, well, I proposed this and it was accepted and this is the cost. And then the employer is saying, well, what you should propose would be something that fell within this figure. And we assumed when you proposed it that it fell within that figure. So it's your look at that you went for an OTT. That's an over-the-top specification that you've had. So the answer is that whenever it has come to the courts, it's been decided on the facts. Every case is decided on the facts. There is no clear-cut legal principle that begins to set the boundaries between design development and an actual variation. You should also be aware that not every variation costs more money. There are variations that precipitate savings. An architect can, by way of his architect's instruction, instruct the omission of one and the reintroduction of the other in the full knowledge that he's saving money. He will have obviously got a nudge in the ribs from the QS saying, let's substitute this to go down to this in order to save money because we're overrunning the budget. So I see what you mean. Whenever you encounter that, my advice to clients always is look at it on the face of it. Ask yourself, have no hesitation in asking the question, what will it cost? Because if you fail to ask what it will cost today, that question will definitely be asked at final account. And then it's too late. You can't rip up the tiles if they've been laid. So someone has to pay for them.
Yeah, I've had the same argument actually with architects on work, but okay, that's great. Thank you.
That's fair enough. Good. I hope that's satisfactory. But if there are more detailed questions in that regard, I can happily take them on, if you like, on a one-to-one basis afterwards.
Yep. Thank you.
Good.
Samuel, a message in the chat.
Oh, okay.
In the event of an attempt by a contractor to repudiate a contract, then the employer has the opportunity to refuse and pursue damages in the normal manner. hence your comment, helpful as it is, only applies when of the intent to liquidate.
That's interesting. Can you read that again?
So in the event of an attempt by a contractor to repudiate a contract, then the employer has the opportunity to refuse and pursue damages in the normal manner. Does this only apply if they intend to liquidate?
No, not necessarily. I wonder if the person who put the question in the chat can give it a bit more life by voicing it, because I'm sure there's a follow-on following what I'm about to say. Now, the breach of contract as a general rule of contract law entitles you to damages. The repudiatory breach of contract enables you to exercise the option to accept the repudiatory breach and bring the contract to an end, in which case you can then pursue all of your remedies, or you may tolerate the breach and keep the work going. Okay? Now, the questioner may well get the sufficient answer from what I have said, but it probably requires further amplification. Often, repudiatory breaches are not preemptive. They are pretty much reactive. You read a particular course of action as being repudiatory, but if you get an indication that repudiation is coming, that is when you can step in and say, you know, don't repudiate, let us do A, B, C, and D. Now, some people will see it as not being mature enough, but quite frankly, what you're doing realistically is stooping to conquer, because you know that greater losses will follow that abandonment. I suspect that I probably would have given that an appropriate answer, but if the questioner wants to take the point of repudiation further, I'll be glad to deal with it.
Perfect. I'm just looking to see if there's any more. If anybody else has any questions, feel free. I'm just looking.
Yeah, Samuel, I've got another question. It's Andrew Diamantis. Hi. You go out to tender, and in your tender, in your instructions to tenderers, you outline how you're going to assess your tenders. And you say to the tenderers, we will accept we'll appoint the lowest tenderer. The tenders come back, and the lowest tenderer, it's quite obvious that the lowest tenderer has priced it far below the other tenderers. So he's either misunderstood the requirements or he's deliberately underpriced it to get the work. Are you legally obliged to appoint that tenderer because that is what you said you would do in your tender documents?
The straightforward answer is yes, and which is why I always advise QSs that one thing you must say in your tender documents, even if your employer has stated to you that we will employ the lowest tenderer, always use the phrase, we are not obliged to accept the lowest or indeed any tender. That gives you the elbow room. Now, I say a straightforward yes to your primary question because if that tender has come, remember that once tenders are closed, the tenders that have been submitted are the tenders that have been submitted. Even if there are errors in it, that is the tender. Now, if you're going to offer an opportunity for errors in tenders to be corrected, if you're going to offer it to one, you're obliged to offer it to all the tenderers in order for you to be even-handed. So once you've seen that tenderer number one is undercutting the market, I think you'd be remiss of the advisors to advise on that tender being accepted, because you know that it will be warfare from start to the final account, and there is a glaring risk of contract abandonment in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Right. So your instinct, therefore, will be telling you to advise your client that this is not the tender to accept. However, you tie yourself up in knots by saying you will accept the lowest tenderer. And that statement that you will accept the lowest tenderer is an indication to underprice. And let's face it, contractors do underprice work in order to win it, because they know that what they lose on the swing, they can gain on the roundabout. So you discourage that by saying that you're not obliged to accept the lowest or indeed any tenderer. And I would still advise that subsequent to that, you call in, if not just the lowest 2 or 3, to have discussions with them. Because let's face it, construction is delivered by human beings, and there's nothing greater than chemistry. And you tend to get that in your post-tender interviews or discussions before the contract is eventually let. Okay, so please, if there's one thing you shouldn't do, never say that you will accept the lowest tender. That may be the employer's intention, but advise your employer in his best interest. You must never state that in your contract documents. Because if you don't accept, you may well find yourself exposed to unexpected litigation as to why you've discriminated against them. Okay? So I hope I've answered that. If there are any further questions, I'm conscious that we're having a quite late evening, but if there are questions, I'll be happy to deal with some further questions. Samuel,
I don't know whether this is a good question or not, but I'm going to try and ask it. In a lot of scenarios, you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar about, having a process to manage variations and changes and knock-on effects. But how do you deal with, how do you adopt a pragmatic approach? And I'm going to say it in my northern way, without being taken advantage of by the other party, by you being reasonable?
Well, you're quite right. There is a fine dividing line between being accommodating and therefore being at risk of being abused. Well, to the extent that there is a legitimate variation, you will know it, the contractor will know it. You endeavor as much as possible to accommodate. Be reasonable is what I say. Again, these cases are always on their specific facts. Acknowledge what has changed. Give ground if you have to, but then be wide awake to the fact where you're about to be abused and say, no, that doesn't work, that doesn't fly. You can be pragmatic and accommodating without being, taken advantage of. That was the answer that I was giving to the earlier question, where I say there are ways, there are very well skilled ways of supporting a contractor on a project. Practically giving them a life support financially, that money doesn't go into their account for them to spend as they wish, but it goes specifically to funding specific aspects of your project. And that will always ensure that your project is successful, that your project is achieved, as it was said, provided nothing else on their other contracts drags them down, you can keep them afloat. That's how you do it, by ensuring, yes, I have money to pay you, but I'm not going to pay it to you blindly. I'm going to pay it for what is actually happening on my site, on my construction site. And if there are any components being acquired, I will retain ownership of them, not you. And that way it will happen.
Have you come across cases whereby there's no actual, so I can think of an example where you've got an architect in the middle and you've got a contractor, you've got a QS, and there's a little bit of a blame game going around.
Oh, yes.
But you end up where it spirals into litigation, whereby that, I mean, I've seen one where you reach a point where the fight has to happen because we're now in the legal system, and literally, once you're in it, you can't back away from it.
Yes, I have been in a case where the project manager determined the contract, and the employer went and took legal advice, which concluded that the determination was wrongly done, and that was because the contractor had started proceedings against the employer. So the employer turned around and told the architect, you're coming into this claim because whatever I go down for to the contractor, you stand to indemnify me because you determined the contract wrongly. And it was actually the project manager that then instructed me to defend him against the employer. So can you see the angle? The contractor is suing the employer for what the employer now says was the architect's fault. And the architects want me to defend him against the employer. My advice was, of course, you may well be better in trying to get your employer to retain me to defend against the contractor, because if we kill the trouble at source, it doesn't then get to you. That was actually what happened in that case. I was retained by the employer, and without prejudice to the entitlements they have to pursue the architect in order for me to defend against the contractor. I should say, luckily we were successful in that case, so the contractor's claim was defeated, and as such, the project manager's skin was saved. So it does happen, but everyone, they were all in litigation because the contractors commenced proceedings. Employer commenced proceedings against the architect. So what we did was stay the proceedings between architect and employer, and then proceeded with that between the employer and the contractor, because we knew that if that was successful, it would kill the other one. But that was how that matter finished. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Excellent. Grand. Do we have any more questions? Are we in the process of winding down?
There's one more here, Simon. There's one from a Mel Faraj. He wants to know, is there a timeline for approving variations by all parties concerned, apart from reasonable time? And who is supposed to do the follow-up?
That's a very interesting question. One will say that variations ought to be approved contemporaneously, if at all possible. Individual contracts will have specific provisions. Reasonable time is what is generally imputed, but the contractor requesting the approval of the variation ought to state the time scale within which he wants that approved. So where a reasonable time is the contractual provision, a party can actually define that reasonableness by stating the number of days. Here, with the changes we've been asked to implement, please confirm within 7 days, 14 days, that this is a variation to the contract provisions with respect to X, Y, Z, so that we can proceed with it. Now, once you specify that timescale, you're now inviting the other side to respond. So although the contractual provision is reasonable time, you can begin to shape and define that reasonable time by giving the timescale. Now, you can ask for it to be done in 7 days. The architect may well say that is too pushy, but you say, well, I need to procure and resource in order to execute. That is why I need to safeguard the contract program by asking you to do it within this period. And invariably, the employer will say, if it's going to cause an overrun, architect, do it in 7 days. I hope it answers the question. Any further questions?
There is one more, Samuel, actually, from H. White. I think, sorry, I'm not sure what it's referenced to, but it says,
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Hi, Samuel.
Hello.
Thanks for tonight. I just wanted to follow up on the response you gave to the question about the lowest tender.
Okay.
And I was asking whether or not, in response to your response to the question,
Yes.
does it depend on the criteria that you would award the contract, even though it's the lowest tender? Because usually, the way I analyze the way I tender contracts, I made it very clear in the tender document that how the tender will be analyzed, and the criteria are given. Each criteria are given a scoring, and so the price might not be the most important criteria.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the lowest price may, in terms of price, the lowest bid would probably stand a chance of getting the job.
Correct.
But there were other elements that give that bidder a lower score. So the overall scoring would then put them at a disadvantage. Then in such a case, that lower bid wouldn't be successful.
Yes, the points you make are very valid. The advice I give is never ever state that you will award the contract to the cheapest tenderer, because what you're doing is you're inviting unrealistic low pricing. And you know in construction that come final account, the contractor will want a final account that covers his costs as well as leaves him with a little margin. It is great that you set out the basis upon which the tender will be analyzed. And in the course of that, one may give you the lowest, and this is a skill, one may give you the lowest possible quote with practically every work element qualified with qualifications in the tender documents. Now you're obliged to take into account the qualifications being made to the tender documents, and if you can, price in those qualifications. So when you have set out criteria for selection, one will expect you, and the courts will expect you, to follow the criteria that you've set out, particularly if you're tendering public sector works, and the same applies in private sector works. So if you set out your criteria, whatever criteria you set down, always finish it that you are not obliged to select the lowest or indeed any, because you may decide, although it wasn't the intention at the outset, to do a two-stage tender process. So you've analyzed the tenders as they've come in, they haven't quite all hit the bullseye, and you want to invite them to re-tender, because you may have identified that it was in your own tender documentation that the ambiguity lay. So you have an ambiguous provision that three lowest tenderers have interpreted in three different ways. You will see it and you say, this is actually what I intended, but they've all read it differently. So I will re-specify what they've intended and invite them either to confirm the figures that they've submitted to be held on the basis of my clarification, or whether to resubmit or to adjust their figures. Now, you find that once you've locked yourself into, which was what I was advising against, once you've locked yourself into having to accept the lowest tender, you have very little elbow room to maneuver and get out of it. I hope that answers the question. Does it for you, HY?
It does completely, yes. Thank you.
Fantastic. Pleasure. Pleasure.
Mr. White, it's
Yes.
Andrew. Hi.
Hi, Andrew.
Yeah, I think you were following on from my question there. Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're talking about cost quality tenders. You talked about analysing, how you're going to analyse. Do you mean how you're going to assess?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
yeah, it's the same. Yeah,
Yeah.
same process.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I read it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how I read it as well. I just want to make sure.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I think you're talking about quality, aren't you? Cost quality submissions, tenders.
Yes, I think in fact, I just I had not long ago I had a tender out for a splash park.
Okay.
And I had a project team, and I was persuaded somehow to allow the tender to be assessed on cost only. So in that we told all the bidders what the budget was. It wasn't a good idea in the end, but there were other incidents where some bidders, and it was a design and build as well.
Okay.
So we got to a stage where we had us to narrow down the bidders, as Samuel was had alluded to earlier about, you know, inviting people back in.
Exactly.
So we narrowed down to about 10, and then we invite those 10 back in. We wrote to all the others to say, look, this is what we're doing, and we thank them for their participation in the process. We invited the other 10 in, and the other 10 were encouraged to improve their design, because what they all were giving us is not what we were foreseeing that we wanted. It didn't meet our specification, our criteria, basically. But saying all of that, because it was the tender was heavily weighted on cost. In my view, at the end, I don't think we got value for money, and I think it was an experiment. But I don't think it's a good idea to, you know, go to tender and telling the bidders what your budget is. That's my view.
That's very well done for giving a live example to illustrate the point that I was making when I asked Andrew's question. Exactly. So, how many tenderers did you actually get?
I think we had over 60.
Wow.
60 bidders
for one project.
Yeah.
Now, on reflection, how would you have done that better if you look at it again?
How would we have done it better?
If you had 60 people intending to tender for your project, can I just ask you, are you a QS architect or the employer?
I'm a surveyor.
You're
working
for
the employer.
Yeah.
For the client, sorry.
Okay, you're the employer's representative.
Yes.
In essence, you've got to appraise 60 bids for him, for your employer.
Yeah.
That is significant, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, there is usually an optimum number that you might wish to aim for. And if you have that breadth of interest, you may then try and use a pre-qualification process, a pre-qualification questionnaire.
Yes, and that's one of the lessons that we've learned, because a lot of the bidders weren't specialists in that area, in that field. Good. So yeah.
Okay, so if you deploy pre-qualification, you can whittle 60 down to 6.
Absolutely.
And that 6 will give you quality submission.
Yeah.
And your analysis and time spent will be more, I think, cost effective.
Yeah.
Good.
I mean, we had a fantastic project at the end, but in my view, looking back in hindsight, I think, you know, we could have saved a bit more money than what we spent in the end, in the long run, the overall project.
So that is the experience that you bring to the next project.
Yeah, absolutely.
As I was saying. Good. Okay, do we have any further questions, ladies and gentlemen?
There's no more questions, Samuel.
There are no more questions. Look, I'm grateful for your questions. I hope it's been a useful evening for you. So I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and I say goodbye and good night.